Welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your life's journey, whatever you believe and whomever you love, you are welcome here. My name is James Carroll. I'm an instructor of religious education here at the church, and today we're going to continue our comparative religion course, and this time we're going to talk about Chinese folk religion and the Imperial Cult. There are obviously people here who know this subject much better than me, and so I encourage them to give comments and feedback, especially if I get anything that needs to be clarified. I'm happy to listen to feedback. I also want to remind everyone that this is part of our comparative religion course, and links to the past lectures and the notes and additional readings, that sort of thing, are all available, as well as links to YouTube videos where we put all these are available at sites.google.com, view comparative religion. And so that's where you can go to see what's been done and to go back and watch older classes. Our last lecture was in January. My son brought home a nice cold and I lost my voice in February, so we didn't have a lecture. But the last one was part 2 of atheism, morality, meaning, and truth. And we just discussed why anyone would be interested in studying atheism in a comparative religion course. And I mentioned that from the anthropology perspective, the sociology department perspective, demography, and comparative religion, it's interesting, both as in terms of atheists, when they answer a survey, that's one of the options. What religion are you? You can select atheism. So you can ask questions about what they're like. And we found that they're predominantly male, well-educated, lived in rich countries, that sort of thing. You can ask interesting questions about that group and compare them to other groups. And we also said, from the comparative religion perspective, we are interested in how people find meaning and truth in their lives. And so from that perspective, those who find meaning and truth from each religion, we learn how they do that. And when we look at atheism, we ask the question, well, how do people without a belief in God find meaning and truth? And of course, I can't speak for atheists, and there are a large number. The ways they do that are as numerous as there are atheists, actually probably more numerous. There are probably more ways of doing it than there are atheists out there. But so what I did is I selected a few sort of famous examples, and I used their techniques in their books, specifically Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Sean Carroll, and Stephen Hawking, and I talked about how they mentioned building a life of meaning and truth without belief in God. So that's what we did last 2 months ago. Today, we're going to do Chinese folk traditions and the Imperial Cult. And why would we be interested in this, especially? Well, China is increasingly important in current world events. There's been a lot of tensions in the area, as we know, but they're also a growing superpower. In terms of peers to the United States, China has the potential, and India have the potential to be economic and social peers to the United States. Russia does not, despite their history as part of the Soviet Union when they were a peer competitor. Russia is not a peer competitor to the United States. India and China have the potential to be, and of course, we would like to find a way for another nation to grow up and have that sort of power and influence without leading to conflict. Chinese leaders often talk about ending the unipolar world. So in terms of what's happening in society right now, China plays an important role, and I think it's important to understand Chinese culture. And religion is only obviously one small part of Chinese culture, but it's of course the part that we would do in a comparative religion course. There's a lot more you should study, a lot more about Chinese history and culture that I encourage you to go out and learn about. But we're going to focus on Chinese religion because of course that's what we do. Now, a chart like this, I put up charts like this because they help me get a big picture view of kind of what's happening. But it is possible for a chart like this to obscure more than it illuminates. On the other hand, there's some interesting big picture items that you can see from this sort of approach. And all religions in the world really seem to start with a core animist belief that our most ancient common ancestors all seem to have some view of animism. Animism is this idea that there are spirits, souls that embody us, but also the environment, the rocks, the trees, the grass, and that these souls and spirits or this power or energy can benefit us or it can harm us. And so we have to find a way to propitiate it, to make offerings to it, to convince it to be nice to us, however you want to explain that idea, and this includes the souls of mankind and of our ancestors. This seems to be a universally held, common, ancient belief. And of course, from that, different traditions have evolved, different religious beliefs, that each take that and go a different direction and sometimes change parts of it, sometimes repudiate parts of the earlier belief and create something new, but they all kind of started in an evolutionary sense from that belief. Yeah.
It's kind of belittling to call it animism when you talk about it sounds like pantheism.
Pantheism is one variant of animism. I think animism is a slightly larger group. Now, animism was a term coined by sociologists and anthropologists, and it probably, a long time ago I should add, and to some extent it has fallen out of favor because of some of the things you just mentioned. It can be considered belittling. From my perspective, it's not. I don't use it in a pejorative sense. There's a sense in this idea of a progressive society that anything that's really old is less evolved, less good, and that we've evolved monotheism from pantheism or animism or whatever, and that's better. And I don't actually subscribe to that view, right? That each tradition has its own value, and animism is one among many. So I don't use it in a pejorative sense. But it does seem to be the oldest religious tradition we have. Yeah, go ahead, Elroy.
Yes, does animism usually include the idea of living after death?
It can, because if we believe there's something animating the souls, the spirits, and the rocks, that includes us, and so it tends to go hand in hand with a form of dualism in terms of our own beliefs. If we believe the rocks have souls, then we have souls, and so maybe our soul continues after we die. This is how this is connected. So the check marks mean things we've covered. We talked about animism a little bit in the sociology of religion introductions. We've had classes on Hinduism and several variants of Buddhism. From Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana Buddhism, we've already discussed. And I was about to then move to Zen Buddhism, and I stopped. And that was a year or two ago. And the reason I didn't do Zen Buddhism is because one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways you can look at Zen Buddhism is it's what happens to Buddhism when it interacts with China and Chinese traditions like Taoism and Confucianism. And so what I've decided is we need to go back and do Taoism and Confucianism, and then we're prepared to cover Zen. But then I realized to do that, we really need to go further back and do kind of some of this Chinese folk religion and the imperial state religions. And so that's where we're at. So this is where you can see both where we're at and also kind of where we're headed from this sort of flow chart. And again, it conceals sometimes more than it reveals. It's not perfect. In fact, if I just kind of flip back and forth, these interactions obviously go both ways. There is a time element that makes this make sense, where they're flowing down. But they also, after they interact, then they go back the other direction, and the influence goes both ways. And so none of these, and they, of course, all influence each other. So none of these sort of charts are simple. It's not a simple genealogy of religion, as it's sometimes portrayed. And nevertheless, there can be some things we can learn from looking at that. So here's what we're going to do. And the first thing I want to do is apologize for my pronunciation. I am going to be really bad at this. And I think that's true of a lot of Westerners who try to pronounce Chinese terms, but especially for those of us who are kind of book learned on the subject. We didn't get to talk to people who are actually pronouncing these things in front of us enough that it rings in our ear correctly. So I'm going to do my best, and no offense is intended, but I'm probably going to slaughter these pronunciations. But we're going to talk about the Chinese worldview. And anytime you do something like that term, it's almost the heart of where racism comes from, and that's overgeneralization, right? There is no single Chinese worldview. On the other hand, there are some averages and kind of patterns and kind of on average sort of things we can say. So we want to do that, but we want to make sure that we're not overgeneralizing or being or giving the impression that this is universal in every way, because it's not. But I'm going to give some broad strokes of the Chinese worldview. Then we'll talk about yin and yang, wuxing, I don't know if I did that right, the 5 elements, qi, supernatural beings, and Kokyan pointed out QI is probably the more correct spelling, but most people in the States have probably seen it CHI. But QI is now kind of the standardized way of spelling Chinese words in English. And then we're going to talk about the Imperial Cult and divination, supernatural beings, the Imperial Cult and divination. One way to look at religion, as you've seen me do before, is to define it the way Stephen Prothero does in his book, God is Not One, where each religious tradition has a problem that it sees with the world and proposes a solution. And then techniques for achieving that solution and exemplars who are the example we follow to achieve that solution. One way to look at Chinese folk religion is to say the imbalance or lack of proper flow in cycles is the problem, and therefore harmony or unblocking these flows is the solution. And techniques include things like acupuncture, tai chi, feng shui, etc., that help you achieve that. And then I should have corrected this. I copied one line and not the other. The exemplars are completely wrong, right? Those are the atheist exemplars. I apologize. So that's not what that chart should look like. That's just one way of kind of, again, as Stephen Prothero himself points out, this systematization really helps us sometimes get at the heart of a religious tradition. Right? What is the difference between Christianity and Islam? Well, Islam sees the problem as pride and the solution as submission to God's will and the unity of God, whereas Christianity sees it as sin, as defined as violating God's will. So it's our free will violating God's will or desires, and the solution, therefore, is some atonement has to be made for that. If you're a Buddhist and you don't even believe in sin necessarily, then obviously you don't see the problem in the same way that a Christian does. This helps us get at the heart of a religious tradition quickly. And again, whenever you do that, you miss the details, right? You can overgeneralize. You can when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so if you pinhole Chinese religion into this idea of imbalance, lack of cycles, you'll misunderstand. But it sort of gives us a first glimpse, which we can then try to refine. So Chinese folk religion primarily began with agrarian origins. Now it's common in kind of ancient history circles today to talk about how early human civilization was more matriarchal and then it became very patriarchal. There is more or less evidence for that, depending kind of on where you go. In China, there's actually some evidence from some of the very early burials that women held very high status, possibly even higher status in the society than men. This very quickly changed, and later Chinese religious traditions were highly patriarchal. But this agricultural origin plays a role, both in its early origins, matriarchal element, and then later its patriarchal element, but also in what they see as important. In this case, not a creation followed by a linear view of progression to something better or different. It's more about cycles, repeating, and finding your place in the natural world and how you fit. And then once you understand the cycles, the patterns, and the flows, you find ways to fit yourself into that pattern, cycle, or flow. And again, that's because of these agrarian society origins. You can see how animism, natural cycles, and the way they understand, like in the West, we understand something by tearing it apart and pulling it back to its most fundamental elements that we build it up from. In all of these examples that I'll give, you'll see understanding a system coming about by viewing it as a system. Who are you? I'm a son of my father, a husband of my wife, a father to my son, a member of this church. I see myself in connection to others. And then through correlations between its elements, its flows, and I'll show you how that works in a bit. Of course, finding harmony is then the goal. There's a fairly strong focus on family and ancestors, but also on hierarchy and bureaucracy, because the natural flow seems to have some influence from kind of a feudal view of hierarchy, which then plays its way into how they think about the supernatural and the spiritual world. So let's begin with the concept of yin and yang. This is something almost everybody in the West has seen, but what is it? Well, it's this idea that the world is part of dualistic opposites, but I don't want you to think of dualistic opposites in the sense of good and bad. That's a very Western view. We'll get to that in a minute. But more in the sense of male, female, light, dark, sun, moon, day, night, heat, cold, heaven, earth, odd and even, and you notice that the boundary between them, this symbol very well encapsulates this idea. This idea is much older, the symbol is a bit later, but the concept that it encaptures seems to be very old and very core to Chinese tradition. And that is that these different parts, this yin and this yang, these opposite pieces, embrace each other, connect each other. The boundary between them is a curved, sinuous line, and they flow into each other. Just as the summer flows into the winter and the winter back into the summer, these things flow and interchange. And there's also a bit of the other inside of each. So, I may be male, but there's some things I do that are stereotypically female. There's people who are female who maybe like some stereotypically male things. And then proper balance in life comes by balancing these things, not by having one triumph over the other, but by finding the proper balance. And so when things are going wrong, it's because they are out of balance in these two halves. I should point out that you can see, let's go back to this one for a minute. You can see some benefits to this view, right? We want to find a way to live that makes ourselves harmonious with nature and with the natural order. There's all sorts of benefits to that. On the other hand, from a Western perspective, nature wants to eat us, right? And so what we need is to figure out how nature works so we can overcome nature and live a better life than one where we are constantly being hunted by bears. Speaking of yin and yang, my own sense of purpose and meaning and kind of my place in the universe feels like I'm best grounded when it's balanced. Because there's truth, I think, to both of those views. And when we have them properly balanced, there's some ways in which I should make myself in harmony with the world around me. And there's other ways in which I should want to take the world around me, yank it by the horns, and change it. So, again, there's benefit to both views. Yeah, go ahead.
Why do odd and even come into unity?
Well, I think they put everything into this, including seasons, foods. Some foods have yin and some foods have yang. So in fact, if you go to a Chinese traditional healer, they might say, well, you're sick because you're eating too many yin foods. You should eat some yang foods. I actually don't know how they divide those up. But they divide everything into one of these camps. And in fact, if you go to the temple of heaven, it has odd numbers of steps because it's yang. And they go to the temple of earth, it has even number of steps because of yin. Of earth, it has even number of steps because it's yin. And so they divide everything up into one of these sort of two camps. I want to contrast this. If you remember my class on Zoroastrianism long ago, do you remember Ahura Mazda and Ahriman? These are the two dualistic forces, one good and one evil. Zoroastrianism influences Judaism and influences Christianity and therefore influences our Western worldview through Zoroastrianism, where we get the idea of a devil from and all this other stuff comes through this interaction. Zoroastrian has trained us to think of dualism in terms of opposites, of good and bad. And in Chinese tradition, what we have is opposites of light and dark, cold and hot, odd and even, heaven and earth, that are not good and bad. But good is balance, bad is disbalance or disharmony, or lack of flow between the two. You see how they flow together. If I were to block them and not allow them to flow, that would also be bad. Okay. In addition to dividing everything into yin and yang, we can also think of wuxing, the five moving things, possibly a reference to the five visible moving stars in the sky, which happen to be the five planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury, and Venus. But that may have been kind of its original interpretation, although we're not sure. It probably has something, well, it's been translated, the five elements, the five phases, and then I love this one, evolutive phase. No one knows what that is. There's a translation that hides more than it illuminates. And the five agents. And it's because we don't really know, there's no equivalent term. The five elements is obviously a reference to a similar concept in Greek tradition called the four elements, the four classical elements of fire, earth, water, and air. It's not the same, but you'll notice some similarities. It's not just about the element. It's about, which is why the five elements fails, it's about their kind of nature. Just as like two or three can be yin or yang. Here some concept can be woody, another concept can be fiery, another concept can be earthy. And you can categorize almost everything in the world into these categories. This one is earthy, this one is fiery, this one is watery. When we talked about the states of matter in classical thought, we did it in the context of alchemy. So we gave a lecture on alchemy, and we talked about how these elements prefigured the states of matter that we eventually settled on in modern science of solid, liquid, gas, plasma, or chemical reaction. And in China, there's something similar going on, but it's not quite the same, and I'm not sure how exactly to explain it, mostly because I'm not sure I quite have my head wrapped around it. But it is this idea that you can categorize things just as you can categorize them into yin and yang. You can categorize them into woody, fiery, earthy, and that helps you understand their relationship to each other through various cycles. So the cycles are important for understanding, I think, wuxing. So here's a illustration of this through the generative and the overcoming interactions, or the conquest cycle and the generative cycle. So let me try to explain sort of how that might work. I have this thing that I want to go away. I didn't want you to do that. Oh boy. There we go. View, slideshow. Microsoft was trying to be helpful and therefore was being unhelpful because it was hiding part of my screen with a little pop-up. Okay. Let me get myself back to my speaker notes. My speaker notes are gone. I need those. Give me 1 second. Turn on speaker notes. Put these back here. And now I need to make this full screen again.
Regain the proper flow.
Yep. I have to regain the flow because I've lost it. I'm totally imbalanced. That's right. All right, conquest. So one of the ways you can think of this is wood digs the earth. Therefore, the earth dams the water extinguishes the fire melts the metal, and the metal chops the wood, and you go back down through the circle. But in generation, wood fuels the fire produces ash, which is earth produces metals, and metals melt into liquids, which is a form of water. You notice it's almost like a liquid. The idea isn't just water as an element, which is H2O. They're thinking of it more like watery things, liquids. And then the water nourishes or feeds the wood. Of course, hopefully not with liquid metal, but liquidy things nourish the wood and feed the wood, which then digs the earth, etc., turns into fire. Sorry. Okay, so you see how these cycles go round and round. And so remember I said that they understand the world through its connections and patterns? You place things into the world into these patterns. This is a yin thing. This is a fiery thing. And once it's placed in those two categories, you understand its relationship to other things through these various cycles, as yin turns into yang, as yang turns into yin, and as they flow and balance, and then as fire creates wood and wood creates fire, etc. As you go around these various cycles, you see their connection and their interconnection to each other, which is very similar to how they view society, is in terms of connection to other people. So now let's talk about qi. So we have the yin and yang, we have the 5 elements, and then we have this life force, or qi. Qi, I'm not sure the best way to say that. But the early associations of that word are with breath and wind, which again is connected to everything we've seen before in the ancient world. So all the old words for spirit, nephesh and pneuma in Greek, and also in Egyptian and Mesopotamian cuneiform, and almost every language we can think of has a reference to the spirit, soul, whatever, that has some connection to the wind, the ruach from God. Sorry, this should be ruach, is in Hebrews the reference to wind. I don't know why I did that wrong. And so wind, soul, spirit, all these things are connected to this idea of spirit, soul, what have you. But in ancient China, the qi is a little different. It's not like the soul of my mother. It's more like the life force that infuses my mother, but also the ground, the woods, the water, the world, It's the life force within all of us. So to get angry is to have your chi rise within you, because your face gets red and you get angry. And so this chi is this life force within us that we feel as emotions, and that we feel in our physical body as our emotions rise. So you can physically feel the chi flowing through you and causing your emotions to rise and contract. So, like I said, it's more of a vital force, cosmic energy, cosmic breath. It bridges the divide between the physical, spiritual, and the mental, somehow, and it circulates in our body and in the natural world. And note again the concepts we saw in all three of these of circulation, flow, and connection, and comparison, contrasting, that sort of thing, finding our place within connections. It flows through the body through these meridians, which are also connected to the 5 elements, which then is, under this view, this is how acupuncture works. You put these needles in specific points, which are meant to unblock these flows so that the chi can properly circulate within you. There are several techniques for harnessing chi or exercising chi. One is Tai Chi, and this word is somehow Taji is the cosmological relationship between yin and yang, and Quan is the fist. So this is like cosmological yin-yang boxing with the air. Tai Chi, and if you see people do this, it's this very slow, flowing movement from one thing to the other, one pose to the other, that actually gives you a physical workout, but also helps you kind of harness and flow your chi. Now, when I did karate, when I was maybe like 12 or something, right? I remember our teacher used to help us. We'd visualize our chi, and then we'd break the board. And I remember if I didn't visualize my chi right, it was much harder to break the board. It worked in that sense. So as a visualization exercise that helps you harness your strength and your focus and your punch, it's a functional way of focusing. Now, as a scientist, I have to wonder, if the force is strong enough to move matter around in this way, why don't we see it? In all of our very careful scientific experiments, it looks like it's not there. And so I see a lot of, Western skeptics will say, well, we know it doesn't exist, it's not there, it's not, and there is no, flow in the bodies in these meridians, and okay, fine. But as a mental concept, in some sense, or even if you want to call it a placebo, it works. So this is I've just stepped over kind of for a second into my personal opinion, right, and out of the just explaining what others believe. So there are ways to view this that are compatible with the ancient view, that it's this real thing that you're coming in contact with, and there are ways to view it that are more compatible with a scientific worldview that still sees power and value in this belief and approach. Qigong is literally the cultivation of qi, I believe, and this is this approach where you have repetitive motions. Instead of long flowing kata from one thing to the next, you have very repetitive motions that are synchronized with your breath that are designed to help you cultivate qi, so you have more of it and you can therefore be more healthy. And of course, it is an exercise technique that therefore makes you more healthy. We have both Tai Chi and Qigong classes offered at the church by Kukyan. And what are the hours again?
The practice session are Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 10.
Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday at 10. So if you're interested, come to those. I used to do that, and I quit a while ago because I just didn't have time, but it was very good exercise and also kind of a mental form of walking meditation that helped me focus and made my life better when I did it. So I should go back to it. I apologize for not coming to that for a while. But again, if you're interested in that sort of thing, this can have very good health benefits. The other way that qi interacts with Chinese folk religion is through feng shui, which has become very popular in the West. People will hire feng shui masters to come and help them set up their house so that it's organized right. So people do this all the time. Feng shui literally means the wind and the water, and it's about the proper flow, that should say, and circulation of qi, the proper balance, and the proper balance of the 5 elements. So for example, maybe your house has an entrance and an exit that are in line with each other. You go in, the front door and the back door, and they're in line with each other. Well, the qi just kind of flows through that too quickly and escapes. So you might put some divisions and winding mirrors to reflect the qi to help it accumulate in the house. Another example might be that in the bathroom there's too much water energy, so you burn some candles to mix in some fire energy. And of course, that's very pleasant. All of us have found burning candles in the bathroom is very pleasant. Well, this is the explanation for why that is in Chinese tradition. There's too much water energy. We need some fire energy. Yeah.
Yes, meaning of two doors in and out sort of thing. Let's say my back door goes onto a balcony and not to the land.
Sure. I don't know. But again, you can go in or out any door you want, but of course the qi would naturally flow in one and out the other under this view. Let me read an example. I love this example. This is from Mark Bergstein's Cultural Literacy for Religion, Everything the Well-Educated Person Should Know, and he quotes this explanation by a feng shui master. He says, "Qi, unless well kept together by surrounding hills and mountains, will be scattered. Only in places where qi is well kept together and having drainage carrying the water in winding, tortuous course, there are the best indicators for a permanent supply of qi being found there. And building a tomb or house in such a place will ensure prosperity, wealth, and honor." And he's quoting an early feng shui text. He didn't tell me which one. This drawing here has to do with, let's see if I can get let's bring up my pointer. Turn on the pointer. Yeah, you can see that better. What he's done is this is a map of the area connected with an auspicious site for building whatever they wanted to build, a house, a tomb, etc. This is the best place for building that because this is where the qi is most concentrated. I want to point out that this description of a good spot to find qi sounds an awful lot to me like a Bob Ross painting, right? A Bob Ross painting. So Bob Ross is this famous artist with the 60s hair. If you've ever seen Bob Ross paint something, this is a Bob Ross painting. Why is it that humans are drawn to such places? And I think there's an evolutionary reason, right? That places with water and mountains and trees and a winding course so that the water isn't just rushing through. These are places where you'll find fish, food, game, plants, animals, a good place to farm, etc. So I believe humans are naturally drawn to such places. And you can feel the draw in yourself. And so when you go to a place like this, you feel it. It's calm, it's good. This is a good place. And so feng shui is, again, I'm showing kind of a skeptic's view, a skeptic who is sympathetic's view of what's going on here. And that is that it's a way of explaining why some places feel good naturally to us. Quantifying what those elements are that make them feel good, and then explaining that in terms of the connections with the other aspects of the cosmos and the world that are part of their culture, like the 5 elements and yin and yang and qi flowing through the area. But again, I think there's something natural about what they're describing. Another way another thing you could compare this to is the study of composition in the West. We'll take courses in composition, and they'll show you that certain shapes and certain sizes and certain ratios of shapes are pleasing to the eye. And so in Chinese, the Chinese culture has also noticed that certain things are pleasing to the heart, the eye, and the body, and they've come up with explanations for why that is.
You can think of ambience.
Ambience, the good place. We use that term, right? And you don't have to believe in something magic for something to have a good ambience. So it doesn't have to be magic. Now, it can be. Again, in traditional Chinese view, that there might be some sort of supernatural element to it. But I think we can all view it as touching something real as well. Okay, there is definitely, though, connection to supernatural beings and forces. And this is related to this concept of animism, where everything in the world is imbued with some sort of spiritual force, including the gods, which then leads to the gods, the ancestors, the ghosts, and the auspicious locations, and then this concept of heaven, which we'll talk about in a while. The rituals performed to control these supernatural forces or propitiate them have to do with leaving out food offerings and burning incense. Also, when we get to ghosts, lighting off firecrackers and this other sort of stuff. So we'll talk about this more. Chinese gods tend to be organized in a bureaucracy, very much probably influenced by the Chinese imperial state. You have the kitchen god at the household level, the land god, that should say, typo, land god in the neighborhood level, the city god at the city level, and then at the top you have the Jade Emperor who is a supernatural sort of emperor of the heavens. We also have this being or concept or idea called heaven itself, and that is very hard to wrap our head around, but we will try. The Saxing are three stars gods, and they are three of the most common deities you'll see in China. They have to do with, on the left, longevity, holding a peach, and an old man holding a peach with a walking staff, and this has to do with long life, prosperity. This is an official. So again, the way to become prosperous monetarily as a regular person is to join the government bureaucracy. And so here's a prosperous bureaucrat in kind of the Confucian model. And then happiness. In family life is where happiness is found, so it's a man holding a child. The fact that these are three of the most popular gods tells you, I think, something about the Chinese view of what makes for a happy life. Long life, health, prosperity, and happiness, in specifically found in your family. Ancestor worship. Again, in connection with this idea that the rocks, the trees, etc., everything around us has a chi, a spirit flowing through it, our ancestors also had some sort of chi or spirit, and they persist after death, and they can do things like answer questions. If we have a question about what we should do, through divination, we can ask the ancestors questions. But the ancestors depend upon us to be fed. So we have to feed them, and we have to burn incense to them and give them honor, because if we fail to do so, they could turn into ghosts. Here we have a series of tablets, and I believe written on them is the name of the different ancestors in the male line. And what you do is you have an altar in your home where you put these names of your ancestors, and then you would burn incense to those ancestors. Go ahead, Tyler.
I'm wondering, back to gods, that are these really like powers that have supernatural abilities, or are they more like attributes, and we're going to give you a figure to go with that attribute?
So in Greece, what we have seems to be something like the personification of natural forces. The way I interpret what I'm seeing here, maybe Kokyung should answer this question instead of me, but when from the various things I read preparing for this, it sounds more like an individual, because a kitchen god can be replaced. The interaction they have with these deities, especially the kitchen god, the land god, the city god, is transactional. And if you give things to the god, and by the way, it's the same things you would give to your ancestors. So it's almost like these are an individual, an ancestor only, that you're now propitiating to be your city god. The connection between an ancestor and a deity seems fuzzy to me. But in that sense, they seem like individuals, and they can be replaced. So very much like there are offices in the Chinese bureaucracy, there is the office of the land god, the office of the city god. And if the city god, you're giving it all these offerings and it fails to take care of your city, you replace it. So you can replace your city god with a different city god if the old city god isn't taking good enough care of you. It can be ousted. And so in that sense, it doesn't seem so much like a concept as an individual who fills a role, very much like an office that a human might fill. Is that, Kokyung, do you have any?
Well, actually, those gods live in the celestial palace above us, just like the human lives on the earth, and they're all different gods up there, and they grant you different things. It's like the Catholic version of saints. You pray to a specific saint for a specific need. So
Yeah.
the kitchen god will, you put a picture of the kitchen god in the kitchen, and it watches you all year round. And on Chinese New Year Eve, you feed it something really sweet, so that on Chinese New Year it goes back to heaven and report your good deeds to the Jade Emperor.
And barring that, it'll gum up its mouth so it can't say what's really going on, right? If you give it a nice gummy. Go ahead, Elroy.
You mentioned feeding gods, but what does that mean? Is that worshiping them, or leaving food by their altar, or what is it?
That's it. You burn the joss-stick and you pray to it, and then you set up all the food that you would have the God eat the spirit of, and then you eat the actual food.
Okay, you set it to them and then you eat.
And then
Yeah. And that is very similar to what happens in Egyptian temples, where people offer food offerings to the god eats the soul of the food, and then they leave it out for the god on a table, and then later the priests eat the actual food. So that's a very universal sort of thing. In fact, there's an altar in the Temple of Solomon for the table of showbread, which is very much the same sort of idea. The priests eventually eat it, but they leave it out for the deity first.
I mean, the thing I always ask when I hear this tradition is there a class of people who are laughing at it?
Probably.
because
Now,
you
like you. Well, so let me before we get too smug about this. It's really hard to figure out how many people in China believe in ghosts. Let's just ask that question. How many people in China believe in ghosts? If
goes, we say spirit.
Spirits.
Yeah.
Well, angry ghosts, depends. Angry spirits, yeah. So how many people actually believe in this? It's hard to say. If you ask them how many people are Taoist or Confucius, you actually get a fairly low number. But if you ask them how many people attend the Festival of the Angry Ghosts, or the Angry Spirits, you get a very high number. Of course, a lot of people in the U.S. will also go out trick-or-treating on Halloween. Does that mean they believe in the spirits, et cetera, behind Halloween? So to some extent, especially the ancestors, I am very tempted to set up an altar like this for my ancestors in my home, because this is a great way to remember them. And I'm even happy to burn incense to them and offer food offerings, especially since I'm going to eat it eventually anyway. But this is a great kind of tradition for honoring and remembering our ancestors and for trying to introduce Sam to some of these people. Now, they'll often have pictures as well as their names on these tablets. You'll have a picture of the ancestor or whatever. And then you will constantly go over and remember them and burn incense. So there's something to this that, again, even a secular person might do, even though they don't actually believe in the spirit or ghost. Now, there are certainly people who believe in the spirit and ghost. But again, I think our obsession with rationality in the sense of not believing in the supernatural is rare in the world. I mean, it's much more common here in the West, but globally this is not the norm. Most people feel the spiritual world implicitly around them, and therefore there must be something to it. They can feel it. And so before we laugh too hard, I think it's helpful to figure out what it is that they're feeling when they think they're feeling the spirit world, and notice that we feel it too. It's just a different explanation for what we feel, and our explanation is not the norm globally. So again, this is not something unique to China, and it's not something, it's something that we see all over the world. So ghosts. Ghosts, now the way I was using the term, spirits sort of is a reference to the helpful ancestors and the ghosts. And I was using ghosts as the term for the angry spirits, or the ghosts. Now that's just how I was doing this in English, because ghosts has this negative connotation. So the ancestors are not ghosts, they're your honored spirits of your ancestors. And then ghosts are these angry beings. Now what makes a spirit an angry ghost? Well, it's just an ancestor that didn't get fed, that isn't being honored by its descendants, that doesn't have altars set up to it, isn't being brought food. Or maybe it died in a mysterious way, or it drowned, or was murdered, so it's a restless spirit. Again, this is something you see in Europe as well. But in China, this is one of the reasons they are so interested in male descendants. So we're going to talk just a minute about what female, some of the later patriarchy that we see in this tradition. Women, part of the marriage ritual is for the woman to bow down to the altar of her husband's ancestors. So she leaves her parents' line and she joins her husband's line. This is very much like what we see in Israel and other places. But why is that important? Well, you need someone to give you offerings when you die to prevent you from becoming an angry ghost. So one of the things that might come up is, I need a son. And this is exactly, by the way, why Abraham is so interested in having a child and a son in the Hebrew Bible. He wants a son. And Isaac, he wants a son. And why? Well, because you need someone to take care of the family line. Otherwise, you become an angry ghost. So again, this is a very old idea. It's not just in China. It's all over the world. But we can still see it in China today. But it helps us understand why there was an emphasis in male children. So when China introduced a one-child policy, there was a certain subset of people who were murdering girls so that they could have a boy, because they needed someone to take care of the family line. And this was having all sorts of, or they were aborting female fetuses before they were born. But there were even cases of murder after the child was born, specifically because they needed a male offspring. Not just for this, but also for cultural reasons. But there was a religious undertone to those cultural reasons that had been around for thousands and thousands of years. You need someone to take care of you so you don't become an angry ghost. So what do we do for angry ghosts? Well, you give offerings to them very much like you would give to a regular person, except you put it outside. You don't want them coming in because they're the cause of sickness and harm. So you in your house, you have an altar to your ancestors, and outside you give offerings to the ghosts, especially once a year. So there is a festival for the angry ghosts, and during that festival, they give offerings to the ghosts outside the house. They also light off firecrackers, fireworks, specifically to kind of scare off the evil spirits. They'll often take lamps and float them down the river to help them find their way to the afterlife. There's a lot that goes into this ghost festival, and it's different depending on where you go in China. There is a video on the Ghost Festival specifically by Religion for Breakfast. So if you go to YouTube, search for Angry Ghost Festival, Religion for Breakfast, he has a whole 15-minute discussion on the Angry Ghost Festival that I highly recommend. It's very interesting, and that's where I got most of my Angry Ghost Festival stuff. So this is where the importance of male children comes from. We also have an idea of heaven, Tian. Originally, there was a deity called Shangdi, who was the highest emperor. I'm not sure how this differs from the Jade Emperor, what the difference is between the Jade Emperor, because they seem like similar concepts. Maybe it's the same? Sangdi, the highest emperor, the Jade Emperor, and there was an annual sacrifice. There is an annual sacrifice to heaven in honor of the highest deity or the ruler. At a certain time, Shangdi, during the Shang dynasty, the Chinese referred to their highest deity as Shangdi. There we go. During the following Zhao dynasty, Tian replaced Shangdi, just in terms of the term most commonly used, but I believe it's the same idea. And it became synonymous with the figure. What is heaven? What is Tian? Well, we start out with this deity. It's a being, just like the god of wealth or the god of longevity. But quickly, I think it becomes this kind of just general concept that is not so much a person as the natural heavenly order of the world, the way the world should be. So we'll talk later about what we call the mandate of heaven, and what we're really saying is we have the mandate of the natural world itself. So I think there's less concept of this as a being. I think it's not quite the same as we would think of God the Father that we would worship. This is more like the pantheistic, all that is. Is that a fair way of saying this? So I got a list here of things. The supreme power reigning over lesser gods that brought order and calm. But it could also be a deity, a destiny, an impersonal force that controls events, a holy world or afterlife, or one or more of the above. So I was specifically keying on this idea of an impersonal force. In other words, heaven can be used to refer to a being, deity, but it can also be an impersonal force of some sort. There's my mouse. There we go. So impersonal force as well as a specific being or deity. So sometimes it can be personified, sometimes it can be an impersonal force. Is that a sort of fair statement? This, of course, leads to the idea of the Chinese Imperial Cult. The Chinese emperors, I think we can see this as a growth out of this idea of spirits and ancestors. If the ancestor goes up to the spirit world, and then because of their position in the hierarchy, just like, maybe you hold the position again, there's a heavenly bureaucracy, and spirits can take their place in the heavenly bureaucracy. Therefore, the boundary between a god and a spirit seems very small. if you're an emperor on the earth, you will take a high place in the heavenly bureaucracy after death. I don't know if that's a good way to explain this. Therefore, mythological emperors, such as the Elo Emperor, who was traditionally one of the first Chinese emperors who invented things like warfare and swords and plowing, and the long list of other cultural institutions were supposed to be invented by the Elo Emperor. He takes an important place in the heavenly bureaucracy after his death. He's one of the spirits that you worship and pray for. And pray for intercession from, just like you would from a saint, right? A saint was a human who died, who is now in heaven. You can pray for their intercession with the heavenly forces. Same thing here. The Jade Emperor is this kind of divine, highest in the hierarchy thing, again, connected to heaven. And this led to the idea that if the emperor on earth can become a god after he dies, he probably maybe is a god already. And so we end up with this idea of the deification of emperors. But again, this flows very well out of this concept of spirit, souls, and intermediaries in this life and the afterlife. Bronze vessels are very impressive, very intricate pieces of art that are some of the oldest metalwork in China. They also have some of the earliest examples of Chinese writing that we see anywhere. And they were specifically used in rituals and ceremonies for the ruling elite, like the emperor and the emperor's cult. So the emperor cult involved worshiping the emperor, again, same way, burning incense and giving offerings, and worshiping the emperor's ancestors, who were part of the ancestral line. And they would give offerings to these beings in these bronze vessels, such as food, wine, grain, to the spirits of the ancestors. And they were also used to hold offerings of food and drink to the ancestors of the past. Again, beautiful stuff and very early forms of metalwork. The emperor becomes what we call the son of heaven, as a title that was taken by King Wu of the Zhou dynasty and subsequent Chinese sovereigns. He's the first one to kind of name himself this title after he conquered the earlier dynasty. He declared himself a god. Now, the mandate of heaven is this unique concept that I think is actually very, very helpful and led to this idea. So in the West, we have an equivalent sort of concept, or similar sort of concept called the divine right of kings, and that is that a king is divinely called by God and inspired by God and has the right to rule. Well, you have an old dynasty which taxes the people too much, stops protecting the people, lets the infrastructure decay, treats the people unfairly. And if that happens, it will lose the mandate of heaven. Now, again, this heaven can be a personal deity, but it can also be an impersonal force. In other words, he's out of balance with the way that naturally a leader should lead his people. This will be important in Confucian thought. Of course, that leads to problems. Not just problems because of too much taxation and unrest, but we also have floods, earthquakes, etc., all indications of the divine discontent with the emperor's rule. And once that dynasty loses the mandate of heaven, they can be overthrown by a new dynasty who brings peace and rebuilds the infrastructure and gives land to the peasants and protects the people. And then this new dynasty will reign until it loses the mandate of heaven, becomes an old dynasty, and again you would repeat this cycle. This illustration is just one way to view this idea, but it is a concept that you wouldn't see, I think, in Shinto Japan, where the emperor is descended from the gods through a certain line, and you have to be in that line. So if the emperor becomes a bad emperor, well, he just becomes a powerless emperor, and the bureaucrats take over, the deep state takes over and keeps the emperor from doing something terribly stupid. That's a Japanese version of how this would work. But in China, you can actually replace the emperor with a new emperor who is himself then deified because he's lost the mandate of heaven, the new emperor has gained the mandate of heaven, and then the new emperor gains deity. And you can tell that he's gained the mandate of heaven because he wins the war that comes about when you remove the old emperor. One of the key elements of the Imperial Cult, that one of the key things we see through it, are the building of certain temples, the bronzes, but also these oracle bones. Divination is an essential part of Chinese religion, and it has been for the longest time. We see it first in the Imperial Cult because that's where it left remnants that we can physically pick up, touch, and discover. And again, the other form of the earliest Chinese writing. So the earliest Chinese writing is on these bronzes, but also in these bones. These shell bones and also scapula from cows' backs are used. And the way this works is you ask a question of the ancestors. Notice how the ancestors are deified and used to propitiate the natural world. So you go to the ancestors, you ask them a question. You write your question on the back of a backbone here at the scapula thing here on the back, the flat, smooth bone, or you write it on this turtle shell. So you have the name of the deity, the question asked of the ancestor, who he's asking the question of, which ancestor, and then you take a hot poker and you stick it in a prepared little, you make a little divot and you stick the hot poker in the divot and the bone will crack. And that cracking has a certain random element to it, and the way it cracks answers the question. This is very, very similar to the way they would use livers. They would sacrifice an animal and then livers have different shapes, and you would measure the different shapes to get answers to divination questions in Mesopotamia. But here it was these cracked bones. The cynic, skeptical in me, says that maybe these professional diviners were very good at how they put these pokers in and would they push to the right or the left, and maybe they could control the cracks. And so maybe the diviners were actually the power behind the imperial throne, because the imperial king would ask his ancestors what he should do, and then the diviners would control the cracks and they could actually decide what happened. But again, that's a certain amount of speculation, but I think it's probably a good speculation that it probably was true that they could control these cracks. That sort of fell out of favor. I'm not sure why it fell out of favor, but the most popular form of divination today is the Ye Ching, known as the Book of Changes. And what you do is you somehow draw lots, or you use randomness to produce either broken or solid lines. One of these represents the yin, the other represents the yang, and you pick 6 of them, and the 6 of them fall into a hexagram, or you can draw them as lines like this, and that gives you a certain chapter in the book. You look up that chapter. So here you say you get this pattern of lines, broken and unbroken lines. You arrange them either like this or in a hexagram. That gives you this symbol right here, and you use that to look up the chapter in the book, the I Ching. You read that chapter, and it will give you something obscure and difficult to understand, and that is the answer to your question. This is very, very popular and famous, and still, as it's made its way into the West, this is a very common now used divination technique in the West. I want to quickly compare it to another, probably more popular in the West anyway, divination technique, tarot cards. And the reason I want to make that comparison is let's just ask the question, I think, what makes for a good divination technique? If the answer is a simple yes or no, that's probably not a good divination technique. A good divination technique has some form of randomness to it, and you would hope that that randomness would then be guided by divine, action if you believe in the supernatural. But the result should be something both random, ambiguous, with flexibility in its interpretation, but also structure in its interpretation, so you just can't be anything. This is also the pattern we see with astrology. The motion of the stars aren't really random, but what it is on any one day is random. That randomness has a formal structure to it that lets you look up a certain thing, but then once you look it up, there's enough ambiguity that you can apply it to anything, and it will always find a way for it to apply to you. Why is that what makes a good divination technique? Well, it's compelling. A lot of people will end up believing in it wholeheartedly. There's a whole bunch of people who believe in divination techniques like this today. But it also has the power to work. What do I mean by work? Do I mean there's something supernatural controlling the outcome so that it gives you the answers to your questions? I don't believe that. If you do, that's fine, right? Whatever you believe, you're welcome here. We're not trying to convince one way or the other. But what is someone like me? How do I view this? If you go to a therapist today, one of the techniques they'll use to try to help you is called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And what they'll do is they'll try to help you create a better story around your life. right? So you tell the story of your life, and they will ask you, and tell me about your mother, right? That's not fair. That's actually psychoanalysis from Freud, but you get the idea. And you tell them about, your mother, and then they say, well, that's a harmful story. Let's reframe that. And in the presence of somebody who can guide things, they will channel you into a kind of a more healthy story about your life or what's coming or what's next. If you go to a fraudulent, palm reader or something, they'll give you an answer that says, please give me $1 million, and but don't tell anyone. Go sneak over and take it out of your bank account, and this happens. But if you go to what I would call a helpful or good one, I don't know if that exists, but I have friends who actually do tarot readings for fun and for free, and some of them have given me worthless readings, and others have given me very helpful ones. And I don't believe in anything supernatural. What marks a good one? The cards. I will ask them a question. How do I relate to my father? He's getting older. How do I get along with him? Our political views are different. What do I do? I have never done this, by the way. This is a completely hypothetical one, right? But what do I do? And they'll put down a few cards, and they'll say, well, the cups has to do with wealth. This has to do with compassion. This card has to do with, and there's an interpretation for each card. That provides the structure. And that forces me to think about my relationship with my father in terms of that structure. I have to now go find and think, well, how does wealth impact my relationship with my father? How does compassion impact my relationship with my father? And then I tell a story about it. And if you have a good reader, they will guide that story as you interact back and forth with them into a more healthy space. What cognitive behavioral therapists will say is the story we tell about what's happening to us is more important than what actually happens to us. So that is kind of the psychology behind why these divination techniques work and why even a skeptic might see them as a working technique. And the I Ching has all of the same elements I just described in tarot, except I'm not as familiar with it, right? I know more about tarot. I've used tarot, had people use tarot around me. I understand tarot. This has all those same elements. It has structure, because you have to now interpret. If I go to the same question, what do I do about my father? I use some randomness to pick some structure, and then up comes a specific reading, and I have to figure out how that reading, with the help of the diviner, the leader of the ritual, I have to figure out how that structure informs my relationship to my father. And as I tell that story, I might come to realizations I had not thought of before. So good divination. You have to ask the right questions. Probably the yes or no cracking bones is not the best way to do it. But the I Ching is a beautiful way to do this, and that has a lot in common with tarot cards and other sorts of techniques that seem to work well. Work in the sense that they can have psychological benefits for the people who use them. All right. That's it for today, but let's talk about where we're going. This is, I have barely scratched the surface. I'm going to show you the future readings, the additional readings you can go to, the sources I drew this from. And you'll see, I drew this from a lot of sources, and there's a lot here that we did not cover, that we didn't have time to cover, and I've barely scratched the surface. I feel like I barely understand this topic myself after spending 2 months getting ready for this. I feel like I barely understand it myself, and I only shared a small fraction of the parts I do understand, what limited amount I do understand. But I think we can't spend forever on each topic. We have to move on. So we've got a vague, at least, background in folk religion and in the imperial state religions. And now we're ready to do Confucianism next month, Taoism the month after that, then Zen Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism, and we'll see what happens to Buddhism as it moves into China. And then we're ready to kind of open things up, but I'm thinking we need to do Islam. I did back in 2015 a short class on Islam, specifically on Islamic temples, where I compared things like the Kaaba to other Christian Jewish temple traditions. It was interesting. It was a short single class, but it was not a comparative religion introduction to Islam. And maybe more significantly, it was not recorded. So it's not available online. And I want to provide that in fact, I've had people online ask me for a class on Islam. So I think we'll probably do Islam after this. Although it's tempting to do Shinto. We're very close to the Asian tradition, so I'll have to decide whether we're going to then do Shinto or whether we'll do Islam, and then go back to Shinto. So, further resources. Obviously, I've barely scratched the surface. If you want to learn more, let me recommend some of the following sources. Cultural Literacy for the Religion, Everything a Well-Educated Person Should Know, by Professor Mark Berkson. I need to say something about this particular one. I usually use a set of sources and I synthesize them into a single lecture, and I've done that today. But Lecture 8, Chinese Religion and Cosmology, that was the topic I wanted to cover. That was his name for this set of Chinese folk traditions and imperial religion. And that lecture had so much in it that was directly on topic that I used it extensively. And so a lot of what you heard today owes its origin to Lecture 8 in this cultural literacy for religion text. He's also got a chapter on Confucian rituals, Taoism, and Kami and the spirits in Shinto, and then East Asian Buddhism, Zen and the Pure Land Buddhism, which again, you'll see future topics listed in his chapters. Stephen Prothero's book, God is Not One, has a chapter on Buddhism, a chapter on Confucianism, and a chapter on Taoism. I will make even more use of this book in the next 2 lectures. But again, this first lecture, a lot of it came from here, but Stephen Prothero will help us in the next 2 lectures, but has some information relevant today. Great Mythologies of the World has 3 chapters, chapter 37, 38, and 39, on culture and the cosmos and Chinese mythology. That one is also very on par, and I used some material from there. Chinese kings, heroes, and dynasties, peasant folk tales, and Chinese scholarship. All 3 of those lectures are relevant for today. Human prehistory and the first civilizations. This is where information came on some of the matriarchal evidence from the tombs. I believe that came from this lecture. The origins of Chinese civilization, China Zhao and the Han and Southeast Asian civilizations. These were all relevant. And then if you want something on Chinese history, which we did not, this is primary religion. If you want stuff on Chinese history, from Yao to Mao, 5,000 Years of Chinese History, this was an amazing course. I loved it. There was a lot, you notice all this is great courses stuff, except for Stephen Prothero. But this was an amazing book, or series of lectures. And the first 6, and also lecture 19, were specifically relevant for today's class. And I made use of those. So you notice I made use of, and in the last 2 months, I have listened to many hours of lectures on Chinese history trying to get ready. And I still feel like I've barely scratched the surface myself, and I've certainly barely scratched the surface in what I presented today. So I hope that was helpful. And as with all of our courses in comparative religion, I hope that what you've heard today will help you find your way in your life's journey, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. Are there any burning questions, or do you want to clarify anything I did wrong?
I want to share a chart. If you
Please.
look around, just get it.
Any other comments, questions while she's...
That chart you had that had the problem with different religions, is that easy to bring up?
Yeah.
Step over here, get a picture.
You're standing in front part of it.
I need to sit myself down on a different side.
Side of the room.
Yeah, there we go.
There it is.
Let me...
So this is called the energetics of foods. It divides foods into all the 5 different elements that you mentioned, and what each different food has different values, whether it's yin, yang, hot, cold, and you can have a diet created with the food so you can get a really balanced, medically balanced thing. It's called the energetics of food. You can get it you can buy the chart.
This is a good illustration of sort of what we were talking about, right?
Yeah.
Any other things I should have said and didn't?
No, this is great.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Is that poster here at the church?
It belongs to me, and I use it in the last class of my Tai Chi classes, when we go over different foods where you eat to balance your energies. So you can buy this online.
Yeah, so I apologize. You're taking pictures of the Stephen Prothero thing, and of course I've done this last bit, very embarrassing, wrong. Yeah, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harrison, Daniel Dennett are not exemplars for Chinese religion. That's very embarrassing, right? What's obviously happened is I've copied this above line and then tried to paste it down and then change it, and I missed a line. I was putting this together this morning, and so I apologize for all the typos in today's slides. All right, any other burning questions before we go? All right, I hope to see you next time. Thank you for coming.